Welcome to Not This, Not That, where we push our boundaries of understanding and perception. I am your host, Reverend Patricia Cajanello, and I invite you to join me as we open to the possibility that things may not be exactly as you believe, as you've been told, that there could be more, that in our collective consciousness is the potential for the all. You can find Not This, Not That on sacredstoriesmedia.com and on iTunes and all streaming services on the Sacred Stories podcast. Today we are continuing our conversation with American mystic, mysteries expert, and best-selling author of 4 books, Tricia McCannon. Last episode, we invited you to push your boundaries of understanding and perception on God as Mother. And today, Tricia McCannon is going to share the hidden history on the search for the Holy Grail and Mary Magdalene's connection to it. So welcome, Tricia McCannon, to Not This, Not That.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Patricia. It's always a pleasure to be conversing with you and our wonderful listeners out there and Sacred Media.
Thank you. Yes. And this conversation that we're having on Mary Magdalene and the search for the Holy Grail is one of my favorites. And I know it's one of your favorites also, right?
Yes, it is actually, this new course that we've just launched has 6 parts and it's about 9 hours long. But the 5th module is actually all dedicated to the quest for the Holy Grail and how Mary Magdalene and Jesus and their mystery stories were all caught up within the stories of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and the quest really for this mythical grail goblet and what it actually all means.
So the course you're referring to is called Mary Magdalene and the Return of the Divine Goddess, and it is located on Sacred U, and we'll post the link in the comments. And what's really awesome about this course is the whole first module, the initiation of the Great Mother, you can watch for free. So we hope you check it out, and we're excited you're joining us now for our conversation on Mary Magdalene and the search for the Holy Grail. So Mary Magdalene, what's her connection? Share with us, Tricia, some of the hidden history that's waiting to be revealed.
Well, the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table is a very profound one, and it's one that has reverberated throughout history for about 1,500 years. And there are many writers that have written, especially through the about 1,000 years ago in the time of the resurgence of the Divine Mother that came forth really when the Kabbalist brought forth the concept of marionette. And marionette was the divine feminine face of God, basically. And of course, the Great Mother had been known for hundreds of thousands of years to humankind, and for many tens of thousands of years when God was considered to be a female. There was no war. Men and women lived together in a partnership model in a world of peace. And then it became the Divine Father, Mother God, which is fine, the Divine Daughter and Son, which are the aspects that come to earth periodically to uplift humanity. And then, of course, the patriarchy arose about 4,000 years ago and really sought to get rid of the mother, the daughter, and the son, and they did. We got the son back with Christianity. We never got the daughter back. And, of course, Mary Magdalene was considered to be an incarnation, really, of the Divine Sophia or the Divine Daughter energy. And we did get an aspect of the mother back, but just to give you an idea, the male apostles got halos right away. It was probably the 900s, 900 years after Jesus' death, before Mary, the mother, was even given a halo. So there was a resurgence of a return to the divine feminine that began to happen around 900, 1,000, even 1,100 years after Jesus. And this was actually caught up with the French courts and the British courts, the English courts, and the troubadours of love that were singing these incredible love songs, and they were really singing it to the goddess, to the divine feminine. And so these stories of King Arthur that herald from the time of about the mid 500s, 550, 570 AD was really about a quest for the divine feminine that had gone missing, that was being suppressed, that was being lost. And if you study the tales, you begin to understand how some of these writers in later centuries were trying to give us in symbol language some of the clues to what they're really trying to say. But for most people, because they didn't know what they were trying to say, it became very obscure and very lost. But there are a lot of ingredients to it. I mean, certainly we know that historically, once the crucifixion was over, Joseph of Arimathea left Jerusalem with Mary the mother, Mary Magdalene, Lazarus, Martha, and many of the other disciples. He took some to the south of France and eventually made his way up to the Celtic Isles, and there he settled and began the first Christian community in the world around 37 AD. And it's said that he brought with him 2 cruets, and cruets are like chalices, basically. And there's legends about what could they be. Some said there was the red cruet or chalice and the white cruet or chalice. And red and white were always the symbols of the divine masculine and feminine in alchemy. Red for the masculine, which is connected with the sun, the solar energy. White for the feminine, which is connected with the lunar energy. And so, of course, we lost the thread of that plot. And so, of course, later the stories were, hey, one caught the blood of Jesus, the red one, and the sweat of Jesus at the cross, which was the white one. But really, they were symbols for the deeper teachings of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which were brought to the Celtic Isles, where the masculine and feminine were honored in a divine balance that leads us to mastery. So this is sort of the beginning of those mysteries. And if you look at the symbols, for example, in the Arthurian table or tale, you have the round table, which is certainly a symbol of unity. It's an ancient symbol for the divine feminine. You have the noble knights that chose right over might. In other words, these were men of integrity, men of conscience, men of goodness. They weren't just, rich, powerful, and narcissistic and, had power and took it from anyone. They, in fact, protected the oppressed. They protected the weak. They were noble knights. We had King Arthur, and we have the whole story of Excalibur, where he pulls the sword from the stone, and this is sort of again encoded knowledge in terms of being able to slice through the bullshit, so to speak, for lack of a better word, through the false lies that we've been told to find the truth. And then, of course, the sword he uses is given to him by the Lady of the Lake, which is the divine mother. It's the feminine energy that comes from the cosmic waters of infinite being, and bestows on him the right to govern the land, which is traditionally how kingship was always passed. Kingship was passed by the queen's line, by the women, because women generally are not interested in going to war. Women are about protecting their children. So they would always choose to protect the lands and sue for peace instead of go out there and, beat on their chest like a gorilla and go to war because they have too much testosterone. So, in the patriarchal world, unfortunately, that's the way many times that the nations act. But in the matriarchal tradition, it's the protection of the land. And of course, in the Arthurian story, we have a lot of different elements. We have the Grail maiden that comes and appears before King Arthur's court, and because once they've made the outer world successful and prosperous, and a right is now ruling the land, the next quest, the next frontier is the quest for the soul. And so she challenges them to find the Grail castle. And the Grail castle is the place where the Fisher King, and of course Jesus was the Fisher King. He came at the beginning of the age of Pisces. And the Fisher King is wounded because and he has a wound in his groin and his thigh. And so, in order to heal the land, if the Fisher King is not restored, the land will dry up. It will become barren. Well, that's basically what happens when you take away the divine feminine. When you subtract the feminine, which is the love and the nurturing from the land, the life-bearing energy, when you make up a story that it's only, the male that creates the universe, that's a lopsided story. Anybody can observe it takes the male and the female to give birth to anything. So, that wound, that Fisher King wound, is all linked to the search really for the divine feminine. It's linked to the search for the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It's linked to many, many things. And if you remember the story, only the purest, most noble knight can find it. And of course, there are different stories. One is that Galahad finds it, who's Sir Lancelot's son. One is that Percival finds it, who is this sort of young, innocent male ingenue who's a little bit of a fool, but he's very pure. He's kind-hearted. And Percival is very interesting in himself. I mean, he lived alone with his mother that he loves with all of his heart. Again, a symbol of the ancient mother. He winds up becoming a knight sort of almost by accident because there's so many knights that are gone. He takes on the quest. He finds a Grail castle, but he was so foolish the first time. He doesn't know how to answer the questions that are asked to him, which are, who does the Grail serve? Who does the Grail serve? And of course, the Grail serves each and every one of us. The Grail serves the land. It's who does the divine feminine serve? It serves life itself. So, and of course, because he doesn't answer it correctly, when he wakes up the next morning, the Grail castle has vanished and he's with his horse in the woods. And so, at this point, he's young and he's foolish and he's naive. So, of course, he doesn't have the answers. But then after 20 or 30 years of looking towards the end of his life, he's gained enough wisdom and knowledge. And in order to gain that wisdom and knowledge, many things had to happen. Like he learns that his mother has died. And again, a symbol for the death or the suppression of the sacred feminine. And he grieves. He winds up having to protect a young woman's honor. There's like many stories about how he gains his wisdom. But eventually, towards the end of his life, once again, the Grail castle appears to him. Once again, he's able to cross over the moat and enter the home of the Fisher King. By this time, the whole land has become barren. Just as the world that we live in many ways, has a part of it that's been missing for a really long time, because as long as we don't honor both the masculine and the feminine in the proper balance, when the feminine goes missing, the world we live in becomes barren at some level. Men aren't allowed to cry or feel their softer feelings. Women are suppressed. And so in this last century, last 100 years, since women got the right to vote in 1922, women have begun to speak up for themselves. Women have begun to be able to work and to vote and to be taken, more seriously, and not just that they're objects to be bought and sold and traded. So this is, of course, a vast improvement, and we're beginning to, I think, enter into an era where the feminine is rising to maybe come eventually to meet the masculine, and this is really what needs to happen to heal the land.
So just to put this in a historical context on the timeline, you talk about the search for the Holy Grail and King Arthur and the return of the feminine, or the healing of the land because the feminine has been removed, right? Let's go back into history and through your research, when and what records show, when is the feminine started to be really maligned or removed, in context with when the legends of the Holy Grail started?
Well, if we go back to Hebrew history, we know at the time of King Solomon and King David that King Solomon built a temple to Asherah, who was the mate of Jehovah, So in other words, Jove and Hera, who were the king and queen of the gods, became Jehovah and Asherah. And certainly the Divine Mother and Father were honored at that time. So that would have been about 3,000 years ago. And we see throughout all the ancient world, whether it was India or it was Egypt or it was Greece, that there were expressions of the god and the goddess in many times in equal measure. But it seems like that someplace around at that point, there were a lot of warlike tribes that came down, and some archaeologists believe it was the Kurgans that came down from Russia, a very horse-driven warlike culture that kind of murdered all the peaceful men in the Mediterranean and basically married or raped their women and took over. And so the women then became more like goddess figures. Some of them didn't have a lot of power at that point. They just were appendages to these very warlike men. Some people think that the Hebrews were responsible, and certainly the priests of Jehovah were. But there were many aspects of the Hebrews that were, very enlightened and very balanced. And we didn't really lose the Divine Mother in the Hebrew culture until after the Babylonian captivity. And Babylon, if you remember Samaria, not Sumeria, Samaria, that had 10 tribes, went down about 722, taken down by the Assyrians, and then around, I think it was 588, someplace in there, Judea went down, and those were the last two tribes, and they went into captivity for 50 years in Babylon. And then when they were released, this was the opportunity that the priest of Jehovah had looked for to be able to basically kind of take over. And so only a third of the Hebrews went back. The other 2/3 really stayed in Babylon. They were happy. But about only 3% of the population could read and write at that point. So they sort of used that when they rebuilt the Second Temple. Actually, the Persians rebuilt it for them and redid the roads because the Persians wanted, the Hebrews to pay them taxes. And so that's how the Second Temple, that became the Temple of Herod, actually originally got built. So this is the point where the Old Testament began to be put together. And, I had grown up, Judeo-Christian, and so I always thought it was thousands of years old, but no, it really wasn't codified until about 100 BC. And many of the books in the Bible were not written until like 100 or 200 or 300 BC. In fact, the 5 books that are called the books of Moses didn't even write them. Maybe 40% of them were written about 300 years after Moses, and the other 60% were written between maybe 100 and 500 BC. And so they kind of, embellished, and they kind of made up their own version. And some things they certainly seem to have gotten right, and other things not so much. So like we have the story of the flood, which they didn't even have until they were in captivity in Babylon. And of course they got to add that afterwards because that story existed in the Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian text. They also added the story of the creation of mankind by the Elohim, which is the gods, plural. And of course it wasn't Adam was created first and then Eve. Man and woman were created together. But again, they changed that story in their version of the Garden of Eden. And they also demonized the serpent, and they demonized the tree. And this is very sad because in the ancient world, the tree of life was considered, these sacred groves were considered to be places of worship for the Divine Mother. It was the life-giving energy of the forest and the trees where all the animals lived. Without the forest, it's a desert planet. And so, and the serpent was considered to be a symbol of the Kundalini, for example. And so they demonized, unfortunately, these elements, and it was very unfortunate. And of course, then Christianity inherited this version, from that particular patriarchal sect within the Hebrew teachings. There are, of course, very enlightened Hebrew people out there. And the Kabbalah, for example, which is the mystical teachings of the Tree of Life, the Star of David, the Flower of Life, the Seed of Life, all of these were ancient wisdom things within their culture. And some of them really got changed. For example, we know in the temples of King Solomon that there was a huge statue of a male and a female angel. Okay, because they knew that there was a balance in the universe. But you come down many centuries later and it's all patriarchal and male. And so the female had been taken out of the equation. She's just basically, a non-citizen. She doesn't have any voting rights. The conquered lands, if you actually read the Old Testament, according to the priest of Jehovah, the Hebrews were supposed to go, take over Canaan by killing every man, woman, chicken, pig, and goat, raping all the virgins and taking them home. Now, I don't really know if they did that. It could be that the priest of Jehovah made that up to sound like that they were really fierce and scary, because it was, let's face it, there were the Assyrians, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. There were armies everywhere. So maybe that's one of the ways they were trying to establish strength as a national identity. Archaeologists have actually excavated over 40 different villages, Hebrew villages, and they never found any weapons. So, maybe they did those terrible things, or maybe they really didn't, but the priest of Yahweh or Jehovah wanted everyone to think that they did so that they would, leave them alone. So, right. You can sort of see how over time, and then of course we inherited it, and the Roman Empire was heavily patriarchal. Yes, they honored gods and goddesses, but they were a huge military force that ruled for 750 years, that took over most of Europe. I mean, they went all the way up to the Celtic Isles and were, fighting battles for hundreds of years up there to try to, and Scotland resisted. Scotland, I don't think, ever fell. But the last battle between the Romans and the Druids took place around 70 AD in Anglesey, which is on the west coast of England. And of course, the Druids had to go underground after that. But they had been a culture that had gone on for thousands of years.
Okay.
So
around 500 AD is when the legend of the Holy Grail really took root.
Yes, and what was happening at that point in terms of the church, there were many different expressions of Christianity. There were like at least 23 sects of Christianity in the first couple of centuries, 2 or 3 centuries. And of course, Constantine, the emperor, wound up legalizing Christianity, which was great. I'm glad he did it around 312 AD. And, he didn't say Christianity, everything, everyone else has to go. He said, we're not killing any more Christians, thank goodness. And, it's there. Anyone can be a Christian if they want to, but they can also honor the pagan gods or whatever if they want to. But then we had Theodosius, who came in around 390, something like that, AD, and he set up these decrees that said, basically, if you're not Christian, you're going to get murdered or killed, and all the other temples are going to be closed, or we're taking them over. They took over 500 churches that had been dedicated to the goddess, and some of them eventually got turned into temples dedicated to Mary the Mother or Mary Magdalene, but it took a long time. So for a lot of those centuries, people knew that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, that there were children, and so forth. But there was a point where they were really changing things, like they took reincarnation out of the Bible. They changed a lot of things in order to sort of say, join our club, and if you don't, there'll be hell to pay, so to speak. And they burnt a lot of books and so forth. They were really, the Roman Empire decided to use religion as its means of enforcing its will, which was very unfortunate. So around 588 AD, we know that Pope Gregory I, in his 33 homily, actually said, this is the first indication we have that poor little Mary Magdalene was going to be, flushed down the toilet as a prostitute, because before that she had been so beloved and so respected. He said, my brothers, where did she get that expensive spikenard that she anointed Jesus's, hands and feet and head? Clearly she must have gotten it from forbidden acts of the flesh. And it was from this sort of, just pulling a story out of a hat that they began to concoct this lie about Mary Magdalene being a prostitute, which she certainly wasn't. But she, in fact, was a high initiate, as I talk about in the class, and she was considered the wife and companion of Jesus. And Jesus called her the apostle of apostles, the woman who knew the all. And so, of course, the church tried to turn it for their own purposes because they didn't want women to hold office. Only men were allowed to be cardinals and popes and bishops and archbishops. So they claimed, unfortunately, Christianity as a male patriarchal, hierarchy. And the only role that women had were either obedience, or they could become a nun if they wanted to, but they weren't really allowed any positions of power. And it's very unfortunate. And of course, many churches now have tried to seek to correct that. The Episcopal Church has, the Baptist, the Methodist, all the, Lutheran, all the Protestant churches now, I think actually most of them honor women as souls with, intelligence and wisdom and heart and spirit, and allow them to be in positions as a reverend or a minister or whatever. And, bravo that they do. I'm really glad.
Right. So just to get back to the Holy Grail, and I know you do a whole module on this in the course. So the course is 6 parts, 6 modules, over 9 hours of teaching, over 1,000 images of video teaching, and you really dig into the legend of the Holy Grail, Mary Magdalene's role in the legend of the Holy Grail. The return or the search for the divine feminine to bring balance back to the world is the heart of the legend of the Holy Grail, right?
I do. And there's so much to say about the Holy Grail. I didn't mean to kind of just go off into ancient history, but most people don't understand how this is all connected, and why did the church want to suppress these legends? Why did they want to color Mary Magdalene, who was Jesus's wife, and who they had children together? And that's because they really wanted to, there are a lot of reasons. I mean, they wanted, the priests were allowed to marry originally in the Catholic Church, but then they discovered that the priests were leaving their homes to their wives and their children. That makes sense. That's what daddies do. But the church didn't want that. So they made a rule to make them all celibate. And so, of course, then they also taught us that Jesus was, of course, celibate and never had a wife or anything. But that cannot be true, because you cannot be a rabbi in the Hebrew teachings without being married. It is considered a natural expression of human life, human wisdom, and human experience. And how can you hope to counsel people that have a wife and children if you yourself have never gone down that path? That's a beautiful wisdom within the Hebrew teaching. And so they have altered history, and we don't know it. I mean, we've just inherited this. And of course, you can see how this is played out in terms of so many men who I'm sure loved God and went into the priesthood in this past century, and probably for the last 1,500 years, but they wound up having sexuality. They probably wanted warmth or intimacy or whatever, and it wound up becoming twisted with these pedophilia problems with children, which is the wrong place for that energy to be directed. It needs to be, men and women, if they wish to have a mate, should be allowed to have a human companion, like a husband or wife, and it's the only natural, fair thing. They shouldn't have to be tortured for their whole life. If it's not about choose God or choose human love, you can choose both together. And unfortunately, that's how the church set it up, so that either you were celibate and you didn't have possessions unless you were a rich, fat archbishop or cardinal, which I'm sure happened in the abuse of power through the centuries. But of course, many of these people who go into service genuinely have a great love of God, and they genuinely want to serve at the highest levels. But, after 20 or 30 years, their human frustration and loneliness is too much to bear. So, it's an imbalance that got set in place and in motion, and we don't know the difference because most people are not historians like I am, and they don't know where to look for this. And it doesn't in any way malign the beauty of Jesus, his teachings, and honoring the divine feminine. If anything, is much more in line with what Jesus was about. He called God the Abba Amma, the Father, Mother, the God. And he talked about the divine daughter and son periodically coming to earth. He said, even as I and Mary Magdalene have come to earth. And so, of course, he says, we were all raised to believe she was a prostitute. How could she possibly be an expression of the female Christ or the female holder of that Christed energy? But in fact, the early Gnostics believed that she was. And the legends of the Holy Grail are all encoded information that is about the bloodline of the Christ, the loss of the sacred feminine, how it creates a wound in the male consciousness. And we can see it played out in the ravages of the patriarchy on men as well as women. I mean, men have inherited a broken system. And so have women. And so we're now at a place where we can begin to bring those truths to light, honoring the beauty in men, because there is so much, and honoring the beauty in women, and honoring the masculine and feminine faces of the divine that, when brought into balance, can bring us to mastery.
And I believe that is one of the reasons that we're so honored at Sacred U to offer Mary Magdalene and the Return of the Divine Goddess course created by you, Tricia McCannon, because it is this history that truly has been lost to us, and it is important that we remember and we reclaim our history, within the proper context. So you've been listening to Tricia McCannon, American mystic, mysteries expert, and best-selling author of 4 books, and the creator of 2 courses at Sacred U. The current one, Mary Magdalene and the Return of the Divine Goddess, and Jesus, the Lost Years of Jesus and the Secret Schools of Initiation. We'll post in the write-up the link to the course. You can watch the first module for free, the Initiation of the Great Mother. So, Tricia McCannon, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you get a chance to watch that first module. It's actually fun, and there's all sorts of gorgeous images.
And the really beautiful part that I like about the courses is Tricia's put so much of her knowledge, wisdom, and heart into them. And there's, again, 6 modules over 9 hours of video teaching, and all of them are yours as soon as you enroll to keep forever, download, and continue to remember and reclaim, our history. So our important history. So thank you very much again, Tricia McCannon, and thank you for listening. You've been listening to Not This, Not That, and I'm Reverend Patricia Cajanello.